Because I don't know what this guy's going to do. But if we read the abstract, he's going to go through Galatians 3 and 4. It's like, I'm not missing that one. And it was awesome. What he does, and again, I incorporate this in reversing Hermann. He went to Galatians 3 to start. And there's that familiar line that the law was added because of transgressions. Plural. See, we're trained to think that the law was added because of what Adam and Eve did and all. It's plural. And he said, now, we're just going to do a little thought experiment today. And it was more than that, but that he was prepping us. He said, what if the law was added because of transgressions? Just whose transgressions are we talking about? What if it's the transgressions of the watchers? I wonder if any Second Temple authors thought that. And then he just dumped on us. Babylonians, of course, looked at this quite differently than Jews did. The scribes took great pains to establish the notion that their knowledge was directly inherited from the gods. See, that's why you should listen to us, because we get our knowledge from the gods. That's where our authority comes from. The problem, of course, is the flood. So, how does this work? How did the knowledge of the pre-flood upcallu survive the flood? There are Mesopotamian texts. Again, one of the more important here is the poem of Era, the Era epic. But there are Mesopotamian tablets, and Anas again has all this, that list 7 pre-flood kings, and just a list of kings, each of them accompanied by an assisting upcallu, the divine sage who gave the king the knowledge necessary for civilization, of course, to rule. After the flood, there are 4 post-flood upcallu mentioned, and they are described as being of human descent. Now, before the flood, they're not described that way. Before the flood, they're completely divine. They're supernatural beings. After the flood, they're also of human descent. The 4th post-flood upcallu is further described as being only 2/3 upcallu. He's a hybrid, again, to use a kind of a clunky word. But that's what the tablets have. These 2 elements, divine beings now of human descent and only 2/3 upcallu, are important for the specific reason we'll get into in a moment. For now, the implication of these sources is that the post-flood upcallu were the result of interbreeding with human women, the same sort of description in Genesis 6, 1-4. Now, Anas was not the first scholar to note this particular point. Ann Kilmer has an important article. It's in a Festschrift to Francis Anderson down here. Here's the citation. I'm not able to post this one on my site, again, for copyright reasons. Humans in upcallu could presumably mate, since we have a description of the 4 post-flood upcallu as of human descent, the 4th being only 2/3 upcallu as opposed to pre-flood pure upcallu and subsequent human sages. After the flood, the totally human sages are called by this term, the umanu. So we've got divine upcallu before the flood. After the flood, we've got kind of, 2/3 and 1/3, or, hybrid upcallu. They're also of human descent. And they're different than the humans that would come later who don't have, this situation going on. Back to the fourth one, the 2/3 upcallu. It's really interesting that this description, being 2/3 divine, is the same description given to Gilgamesh, who is called Lord of the upcallu in one existing cuneiform text. Gilgamesh was also a giant. Like, seriously? I mean, you see what's happening here. All of the elements are emerging from this story. Gilgamesh was a giant in Mesopotamian text. He's also mentioned by name in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Book of the Giants. What a coincidence. Well, how do you like that? The apparent mating with humans displeased Marduk in the Mesopotamian story. Marduk doesn't like this Because if you remember the Mesopotamia, the flood story, you know, some of the higher up gods are like disturbed from their sleep by humans. Oh, they're noisy. They're just kind of a pain. Let's destroy them all. And so the gods get together and say, yeah, you know, I'd like a few more hours in it every night. So let's get rid of them. And so that's what they decide. Now the upcallu hear about this and it's like, good grief, man, we put a lot of work into these people. That's terrible. We got to do something to make sure that our work survives. And so they do what they do, and you get the hybrid upcallu situation go on. And Marduk hears about it, and he's like, oh, that ticks me off. Don't you realize where you're at in the pecking order here? You do what I say, not the other way around. You don't circumvent what we're trying to do here. So what Marduk does is he judges the upcallu by sending them back to the abyss, never to return. Does that sound a little bit like getting sent into the abyss, into Tartarus, and chained in gloomy darkness until the time of the end? Here's a summary. Pre-flood upcallu were wholly divine. Post-flood upcallu are of human descent. They dispense divine knowledge to humans, which is, to the Jews, this was horrible because it produces depravity and idolatry. To the Mesopotamians, this is like, man, you guys are awesome. Because even though the higher up gods wanted to wipe us out, some of us survive, and your knowledge that helped us build civilization survives too. You guys get 2 thumbs up. So the Mesopotamians viewed the upcallu positively. The higher gods, again, don't. They sentence, Marduk sentenced the upcallu to the abyss. They are kicked out of the divine council. They're rebels. They're in a state of rebellion now. Every element of Genesis 6:1-4 is accounted for. Gilgamesh is the key connection, who is specifically referenced in the Book of the Giants at Qumran and a few other places. So what's the point? Mesopotamian religion, upcallu, were wonderful. They're the reason for Babylon's greatness. The reason Babylon is the top of the heap. In Israel, that's not really good news. There are 2 things that are the problem. One is you've got the giant clans, okay, and the physical result of this, again, however this works, I'm not a deity, so I don't know, is that we have rival people groups running around now, and ultimately in the biblical story, they're going to be the ones that confront the Israelites in their quest for their homeland. And as I detail an unseen realm, it's my view that the details of the conquest tell us that the harem, the devoting to destruction concept, the devoting to destruction thrust of the conquest is specifically aimed at eliminating the Anakim, who are the descendants of the Nephilim according to Numbers 13, 32, and 33. There are a number of reasons why I say that. The conquest narrative begins with the Anakim, who are, again, the descendants of the Nephilim, according to the biblical text anyway. They're the ones that are spotted by the spies. The spies come back and say, man, we love this place, but guess what? Let's just turn around and run because we're like dog meat. We're just going to get our butts kicked here because they're huge. They're a whole lot bigger than we are. And that leads to God's punishment of the 70 years wandering. They come back, and God sends them up the Transjordan. Well, why does God do that? Well, he tells you in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. He tells Moses and Joshua, now look, you got to go up the other side, and you leave the Ammonites alone, you leave the Moabites alone, because the descendants of Esau, who is also related to Abraham, the descendants of Esau have already eliminated the giant clans in their regions. They're known as the Amim, the Zamzumim, the Zuz. Just leave them alone. That job's taken care of already. But you got to go up to Bashan because there's still a few of them there. Og of Bashan, Okay, Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites, which is an important term in the narrative. Og is a giant. He is described as the last of the Rephaim. But if you go to Amos 2, 9, and 10, when he describes the conquest, he uses the word Amorite and says, they were tall as cedars. It's not a coincidence. The Anakim, Rephaim, descendants of the Nephilim, all this stuff. So Moses and Joshua have to go up there and take care of business in the Transjordan. Then God says, now you come down, you cross into the land in the middle, the divide and conquer strategy. And at that point, when you get the battles, the kerem verb and the verbs of killing, the verbs of annihilation, occur in battles in places where the Anakim are said to live in the conquest narrative. I don't think that's a coincidence. Because at the end of the conquest in Joshua 11, how does Joshua define victory? There are no more Anakim in the land, except for the ones that escaped and got away, and they went to the Philistine cities, Gath and Ashdod. And where do we encounter the rest of them? Later. Goliath and his brothers. This is where they're from. The goal, now there's a lot of people killed, because it's not like you can blow a whistle and say, okay, like separate your Anakim here, the rest of you, there are other verbs of conquest in Joshua. Dispossess, drive them out, that are not verbs of killing. But the killing nomenclature occurs in passages, in places, cities and regions, especially the hill country, where the Anakim are said to live among the population. Now, the general population is fighting for their homeland. We get that. But the cherem, to devote to destruction, God is claiming the life of this thing, are the Anakim. You'll never see that if you're not if you're debunking Genesis 6, 1 through 4. You'll never see that. Because you want to say the Anakim or something other than what the text has. They're always described as unusual. And I don't think we're talking 10, 12, 30 feet high. Goliath himself, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, was 6 foot 6 inches tall. Maybe 6'9", depending on what cubit you're using. Masoretic text has him taller, but the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls have him at 6'6". That is significant if the average human male, going by skeletons that have been excavated, in the Second Temple period, or not the Second Temple, the Old Testament period, second millennium, is about 5.5 feet tall. If you're 5.5 feet tall, go visit a basketball game, go to the NBA. If you're running into pockets of these people, and they're trained warriors, you're just a bunch of escapees from Egypt, okay? And they've got walled cities. It's like, what are you going to think? Well, if you're Joshua and Caleb, you think, Red Sea, no problem, okay? If you're everybody else, you think, where else can we live? Okay, this is just not going to go well. And of course, they pay the price for that. So we've got that plan, but the worst of it is the corruption of humanity. That is a problem. The Anakim stuff, the Nephilim, that's taken care of during the days of David. But this is not. This persists, and this becomes a huge focus of Second Temple writing. The fact that humanity is so bad, in part, because supernatural intelligences taught us to destroy ourselves and led us away from the true God. That has to be fixed. The Messiah is supposed to fix 3 things, not just one. See, we're taught, again, that the reason why the world is the way it is the fall, because that's the only one that we accept as rational. Again, that's just as non-rational as anything, all the core documents of Christianity. If you asked an Israelite, 2nd century or Second Temple period Jew, why is the world such a mess? 3 reasons: the fall. And what's the problem? What's the problem the Messiah needs to cure at the fall? The death problem. You're no longer going to have everlasting life. You're under the curse of death. So the Messiah needs to fix the death problem. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, well, all that funky Anakim, Nephilim stuff, David took care of that. And again, isn't it nice that David is the prototype, the dynastic prototype and producer of the Messiah? David took care of that, but the Messiah who comes needs to address human depravity. By the way, how does he do that? The Holy Spirit. Jesus says several times, I have to go so that the Holy Spirit can come and reside within you. That is the blunting of depravity, the presence of the Spirit in the life of the believer. And Paul says on 2 occasions, the Lord, who is the Spirit. I mean, the Spirit is, again, it's just like Jesus and God. Jesus is but isn't God. He is God, but he's not the Father. The Spirit is but isn't Jesus. Well, he's separate and distinct. He's a person within the Trinity, but he's also in some way Jesus and God. It all works together. And Paul on 2 occasions refers to the Lord who is the Spirit. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am in their midst. Gathered in my name, they're believers. It's the Spirit. So the Messiah is supposed to fix that. And the third thing the Messiah is supposed to fix is the third rebellion, which is Babel, the disinheritance, the divorcing of the nations. The nations need to be brought back into the family of God through the seed of Abraham, who is Jesus. It's a coherent, comprehensive plan. It's 3-faceted, not just one. But you'll never see the other 2 because we demythologize our Bible. That's why. So, the Jews are thinking all that. And it's like, man, the Messiah needs to fix, he's got a huge mess ahead of him, So we understand, again, the context for Genesis 6:5. And what we need to do is we need to read Genesis 6, 1 through 4 as a polemic response to the Mesopotamian theology of the day. No, the upcallu are not good guys, and their transgression of heaven and earth was not a good thing. It led potentially to our annihilation as a people because of all the Nephilim stuff, and it corrupted us. It made humanity wicked. It drove humanity away from the true God. It's not good. So you Mesopotamians out there, think what you will, okay? But the biblical writers are writing their own, again, primeval history all the way up, to Abraham, and then everything else runs from there. And they want you to know that this episode, and I mean, who's Israel? I mean, they're gonna be, these other nations are gonna wipe their feet on Israel. So God wants people to know through the biblical writers that, look, you're going to hear that the reason that you're beaten, the reason that you are just inferior to these people is because of their gods, and specifically in Babylon, which is where the Old Testament story ends. You're going to hear that the reason for Babylon's superiority is that they are empowered by their gods. This is the reason why they're great. This is the reason why Babylon is incomparable. This is the reason why we conquered you. You're going to hear all that stuff, but we want you to know what the real story is and who's really in control. And this is why these 4 kind of, funky verses are there. It's part of a theology to help the family of Yahweh cope with their circumstances and their history. It's part of a theological response. Again, that's the end of what we'll do here. But again, we have lost this, essentially. Part of the whole Watcher thing, it leaks into the New Testament. I'm not going to go through reversing Hermann here because, there's I don't know if we have a lunch prepared or what's going on. Or Q&A. But there are all sorts of ways that this idea that the Messiah has to fix this, 3 problems, but in reversing Hermann, I zero in this middle one, this whole Genesis 6 problem. there are a number of things that you'll, if you know the story, you'll read in the New Testament and you'll, okay, I know what he's tracking on here. I'll give you one example. It's probably 4 years ago now. I was at SBL, which is the Society of Biblical Literature. And it's not an evangelical group. It's just, anybody who does biblical studies in the world. So I'm going through the program, and some of you who listen to the podcast have heard of David Burnett. Burnett's with me sitting, and we're going through the program. And I saw a paper by a guy named Tyler Stewart, who was at the time a doctoral student at Marquette, which is where Burnett is now. And the title was something like Bastard Spirits, the Watchers, and the Birth of the Son of God. And now bastard spirits is what the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to. That's another term they use for the Watchers because they're hybrid. And we looked at each other, and it's like, we are going to be in that room. We are not going to miss this paper because I don't know what this guy's going to do. But we read the abstract. He's going to go through Galatians 3 and 4. It's like, I'm not missing that one. And it was awesome. What he does, and again, I incorporate this in reversing Hermann. He went to Galatians 3 to start. And there's that familiar line that the law was added because of transgressions. Plural. See, we're trained to think that the law was added because of what Adam and Eve did and all. It's plural. And he said, now, we're just going to do a little thought experiment today. And it was more than that, but that he was prepping us. He said, what if the law was added because of transgressions? Just whose transgressions are we talking about? What if it's the transgressions of the Watchers? I wonder if any Second Temple authors thought that. And then he just dumped on us. And it's like, holy cow, like I didn't realize that there it is. And it was just unbelievable. And then he tied it to the timing of the birth of the Son of God. And it was like, oh boy, I got to get this paper. What do I have to do to wrestle this from your hands? And he was nice enough to give me the paper. But there are just things like that Second Temple period writers, they thought about that line, that idea, quite differently than we do. And when you get into that literature, you see that ain't the only place. There are things just dropped here and there in the New Testament that link back into not only Second Temple literature generally, but link back into this story in all sorts of really interesting ways. And this is why yesterday, when we talked about Enoch, look, it doesn't matter what status you assign or don't assign to the book of Enoch. What matters is that you become familiar with material that the biblical writers read, because they're going to be responding to things. They're going to be dropping stuff. They assume that their audience will, again, pick up what they're laying down. They assume a familiarity that we just don't have. So it takes us work to recapture that. But you can do it. Again, I'm going to close with this, a little part of my own testimony. And I told you yesterday, when I became a believer, I basically didn't know anything. My parents got divorced when I was 5. My brother was 3. My mom had to go out and work like single moms do. And even when she got remarried, my dad was an alcoholic, and so he couldn't keep a job. So my mom has to work all the time. And so we got shipped to my grandma's a lot. Now my grandma lived next door to a family, single mom again, with 4 kids. 2 of them had cystic fibrosis. I don't know how she made it, because they just struggled mightily. We had it good, like compared to what's going on over there. So, but they were Christians. The lady was a Christian, and her oldest son became my best friend growing up. If you've read my novels, Brian Scott, it's this kid's name. Okay, so I go over to his house, and they have devotions. And so I'm there, I'm either sleeping over or whatever, I'm allowed to stay. And I'm marveling, like, this kid knows, like, who's this Abraham dude? And, I just thought that, like, he was just this fount of information. And he's 9, okay? It's just like, I don't know what's going on here. But it was through then that I get my first exposure to the gospel. And, later on, I only really became a Christian. I really only grasped the gospel when I was 16, when we were in high school. But I really didn't know much more because I never read the Bible. I'm not over at this kid's house every day. So there I am. And so I start reading the Bible. So what I tell people, because I get it, it's like you can listen to this stuff, you can watch the YouTube video, all that stuff, listen to the podcast, and you think, there is no way I'm ever going to know the things I want to know. It's just overwhelming. It's not overwhelming. It's overwhelming if you look at it cumulatively. Okay, I am the result of 5 minutes a day for a long time. If you learn one new thing about Scripture or about some point of context, if you learn one new thing every day, in 365 days, you got a good pile. And that's 1 year. You have to break up the task into digestible bits. That's all I did. Now, I'll confess I was a geek, right? I couldn't, not do it. So I'll confess that part. But if you have enough ambition to just learn something new every day, you are going, in a couple of years' time, you're going to be a rock star in your church, okay? You're going to be the one that gets the questions because you're learning. You're learning. And this is why I believe, sincerely, that most pastors dramatically underestimate both the appetite and the aptitude for content. I do not have a photographic memory. I had a good memory in high school. It's the only thing I was kind of good at was school. I played sports and all that kind of stuff, but I wasn't getting any scholarships, trust me. I had no I could regale you with ridiculous stories of how dumb I was in high school because I had no direction. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll tell you just one, just to show you how bad it was. We go in to take our SATs. Everybody who's been to high school, you got to take SATs. So I'm like everybody else. I'm herded into this room. You put the paper down in front of you. You got a pencil. Yeah, take this test. Well, at the end of the test, it says you have to put a number in to get your scores sent to a college, or they won't take the test. It's like, what do you mean you won't take the test? I'm done with it. Hey, you got to put a number in. And I'm like, really? I don't know. So they give you the list, all these numbers of institutions, and I'm looking through the list. And I put the number in for the University of Kentucky. Why? Because I went to high school with Sam Bowie, who was drafted ahead of Michael Jordan. That's his claim of infamy. And Sam was going to the University of Kentucky. And so I thought, well, if I go there, I'll know somebody. That's what I did. I had no direction at all. Here's the test. You happy now? I don't know what I'm doing. So again, I did not go to Kentucky. I tell you stuff like that because you got to get away from this notion that this is an insurmountable mountain. It's not. The dirty little secret is that you can actually do a lot of this stuff. I'm fortunate that I work at Logos, and we manufacture all these tools and stuff like that. And that's why it's there. You live at a unique time. Never before. I didn't have any of this stuff going through college and graduate school. I didn't have software. If it existed, I couldn't afford it because I'm putting myself through school. I mean, but you have the internet. You have software. You have access to an amazing amount of material. Your task in that level in terms of access is both easier and more complex because there's just so much now. But it's still something that's reducible to a little bit of your time every day. So don't look at this like it's just this, I'm giving up, I'll read your book, but I'm out of here, No, don't check out. Don't check out. Because you actually can do this.